Creepypasta time, your free trial to life has ended. We've all done it. There was a show or movie we wanted to watch, so we signed up for a week, 2 weeks, or a month of some subscription service, just to watch that show/movie. You might have cancelled right after watching, or perhaps held on to see if there was anything else you'd like. And, like many, you might have forgotten about the subscription, and been unpleasantly surprised days or weeks later when a sudden charge appeared on your bank account. You tell yourself, I could have sworn that I cancelled that. You probably tell this to the customer service representative you inevitably speak to when trying to get the charge reversed. Typically, they're compliant, they deal with this issue all day, every day, and feel no offense on behalf of the company that employs them. They've probably been in the same situation, at one point or another. You suspect this, so you lighten up, maybe apologize if you were rude, and a few minutes later you're assured that the charge would be reversed, your money returned, as soon as your bank initiates the action. That's the fundamental hassle with these free subscriptions. I've been there, many times. I've asked myself, already knowing the answer, if it's a free trial, why do I have to put in my bank information? Because, at the end of the day, they're relying on just such forgetfulness, and not just that, but overall complacency and laziness once the trial is ended and the first charge goes through. Many people, upon seeing that stealthily transacted charge, probably think, you know what, why not? They've got some pretty good stuff on here. And allow it to ride, indefinitely. And, B, because anyone can set up a new email. There are dozens of services and it takes only a few minutes at the longest. So, theoretically, if cards or other payment methods weren't required, the entire user base of a service could simply farm unlimited free trials by creating new email accounts. Being first and foremost a business, this would of course be detrimental to the service. It's definitely a first world problem, an occurrence that has undoubtedly happened numerous times to the average American, especially in the last few months to years. I know I've become accustomed to it, and have made an effort to routinely remind myself of a trial's duration. If the service is especially sinister in its business practices and does not have a turn-off auto-renewal option in the account management section, what I hadn't expected, what I hadn't had any experience with which to grow accustomed, was the sudden cancellation of a subscription I hadn't personally signed up for but a subscription that was nonetheless vital to my life. My life itself was a subscription. I was, in essence, a proxy email, a throwaway account, a pseudo-identity with which something, had signed up for a life experience. My life was not managed by myself, as I'd been led to believe for the last 2 decades, and, upon failing to charge the controlling entity's payment method, the renewal process couldn't go through, the service of life was cancelled, and I suffered the most terrifying experience of my life. The sudden interruption of one's life by external and unforeseen means would be jarring to anyone. Going about your day, thinking everything is just fine, and then wham, your world is split down the middle, your life halted, your perspective mortally focused onto a single point, a single impetus, the continuation of your existence. I was walking out of my apartment complex, heading up the street to the nearby market for some ingredients for dinner later, when the sky suddenly darkened. It was around noon, and while I hadn't watched the news, there weren't any perceptible signs that a storm was on the way. Since there was no coverage on the sidewalk besides the occasional tree planted at intervals opposite the street, I decided to turn into a nearby neighborhood and traverse through its streets. Its main road led to the street on which the market sat, so I wasn't losing significant time. I figured the houses, though not overheard, would at least provide more shielding from a storm that the open expanse of the sidewalk would, but as I walked, I noticed that the sky was only darkened immediately above me, not behind or before. There was a definite umbrage, tied exclusively to my being, that followed me wherever I went. Momentarily forgetting that I was out in the open, unsettled by this bizarre phenomenon, I turned and walked in every direction, probably looking very silly if not crazy as I tried to dodge the overhanging shadow. But nothing I did worked, and it followed as if invisibly tethered. It was eerie, foreboding, but seemed for the moment innocuous, so I continued along, hoping that it would disappear when I entered the store. I'd gotten plenty of sleep the night before, and had had a decent breakfast, so I was sure that it wasn't the psychological result of some sleep-related or nutritional deficit. Arriving at the store, I retrieved a card and entered. hoping that upon looking up I'd only see the lights and signs of the store above me. And while I had indeed seen those, I also saw that strange occlusion of light, which darkened the ceiling above me, and pursued me as if it were some inversion of my shadow upon the floor. I tried to maintain my composure, despite how utterly unsettled I was. I pushed my cart along an aisle chosen at random, and occasionally selected an item from a shelf so as to not appear weird or suspicious by just walking along, looking at nothing. The shadow, which was vaguely circular, matched any pace I set, but otherwise displayed no behavior of note. Despite this absence of malevolent activity, my fear grew exponentially. Something told me that there was a process, an evaluation, presently at play, and that upon the completion of this process, something terrible would happen. When my cart had been stocked with items I hadn't actually wanted, I decided that I should regain control of myself, get what I'd come for, and leave regardless of the shadow's attachment. I reconsidered the idea that perhaps I might be tired, and decided to take a nap before starting dinner. I slyly emptied my cart of the items I hadn't planned on buying, obtained the originally desired items, and went to checkout. With my purchases made, I left the market, not bothering to see if I was still being pursued. I could tell, even while staring ahead, that the sky was shaded by something, immediately above me, yet perfectly clear elsewhere. I didn't bother going back through the neighborhood I'd originally come through. There was no storm, not a naturally formed one, at least to avoid. In order to get to my specific building in the apartment complex, there is a common ground that I must pass. Due to the weather, it had rained earlier in the week. The area is seldom used. There is a dip in the lawn, a massive bowl-like depression in the grass, that fills up with water and turns the ground into a muddy, disgusting, soup-like mess. In the summer, kids ride their bikes into it, but any other time it's avoided. Unfortunately, such unpeopled circumstances were ideal for the arrival of a truly horrifying entity. As I began to cross the lawn, the shadow accelerated, going well past me. At first, I was elated, thought that somehow the shadow had lost interest in me, and was going on to silently harrow some other person. But after going about 20 feet ahead, it stopped and hovered over the center of that large depression in the ground. For a moment it did nothing else, but then its color, which had been a dull, yet somehow sinister gray, changed to a deep, pulsing red, and a great shaft of crimson light shot down from the newly illumined nimbus. The pillar of light touched the grass, but did not seem to affect it in any damaging a way. The sanguine halo from which it had issued remained for a moment, then disappeared, and the pillar followed suit shortly after. In its place, kneeling in the depression, was a figure out of some chthonic nightmares. A multi-winged horror steadily, silently ascended the depression, until it had come to stand upon the rim, glaring at me with baleful, inscrutable eyes. 2 eyes, smaller than a man's, sat at its temple, 2 more were embedded vertically into the broad forehead, and a final pair sat on opposite sides of a thick, sagging neck. There were no eyes that existed above the cheeks, as they be found on a human face. This creature's face, its entire body, was horrifically inhuman, and I've only spent so much effort relating the details of its eyes because everything else is nearly indescribable. So much of its body was morphologically nonsensical, anatomically abhorrent. Wings and eyes are the only things that visibly made sense, the only things I could actually focus on with any kind of comprehension. From the end of an appendage, I am hesitant to call it a hand extended, a feeler, or a bulb, some plant-like projection, that curled through the air until it reached me. I stood absolutely petrified, hoping that I was suffering from some sort of neurological shock, that the present image of unreality was the result of a sudden brain affliction related to the shadow. But the projection touched my cheek, and I felt its uncomfortably warm skin stick to mine, using some sort of naturally produced adhesive. After that, I felt a sudden neurochemical rush. My brain was flooded with a mind-altering substance, or a telekinetically imparted emotion, and I found myself entering into some kind of communion with the monstrous being before me. I heard a voice speak to me, and despite the absence of anything I could discern as a mouth, I knew that the voice had come from the entity. It spoke again, and I realized that it had said my name, in a questioning way, as if it demanded that I confirm my identity. Stupefied, I answered, if only to avoid any violence that might come to me if I were non-compliant. Its many eyes blinked, sometimes in unison, sometimes just 1 or 2 at a time. I don't know which was more unsettling. It considered my answer for a moment, then spoke again, saying, "The trial of this vessel has reached its conclusion. The token required for the vessel's continued use has not been provided. The vessel cannot be used beyond this day, and must be destroyed. If the controller wishes to continue with the life experience, a new vessel will be issued upon confirmation of a valid token. Please stand by for corporeal annihilation. The disgusting, tendril-like extension was then retracted, and the entity's eyes blinked quickly, seemingly at random. I hadn't understood any of the nonsense it had said, except for the final part, which had announced that something, presumably myself, was to be destroyed. Ignoring the residual pain in my cheek where the tendril had attached itself, I spoke aloud, feebly asking this monstrous thing what exactly it had meant by corporeal annihilation. The eyes ceased their frantic fluttering, the thing that was only vaguely a hand opened, and that horrible tendril flowed out again. It attached itself to the opposite cheek, which I guess I was thankful for, considering the rawness of the other one. Corporeal annihilation, the total obliteration of this vessel. You. Horrified by the clarification, I stuttered out a request for further elaboration on why exactly I was being destroyed. You're a vessel, licensed and utilized by my enterprise. Through you, our clients, those without corporeal forms, may experience physical existence, in your case, human life. My horror was momentarily eclipsed by curiosity, and with a voice slightly less intoned with fear, I asked if all of humanity was simply a business venture for this creature. Before replying, all of its eyes blinked simultaneously, as if it couldn't believe I had just asked such a question. No, that is, impossible. There are 7 billion of you, and 6 of us. Only an infinitesimally small fraction of this galaxy's inhabitants are licensed vessels. Of humans, we presently utilize 4. You are one of them. Through a rigorous screening process, you were selected, and made the property of my agency. Anger then usurped curiosity, and I asked on whose authority such an existentially momentous decision was made. The creature again performed a very expressive sequence of blanks. Well, ours? There is not governing agency within this galaxy who oversees our conduct. Does your species request permission from the sheep when you do whatever it is you do with them? We selected members of your species based on factors I cannot disclose. Offer trials to phantasmal entities, who then silently inhabit the body, or passively view its experiences through other means, whilst the body and its owner are entirely oblivious to the transaction and service. I was extremely angry then, and probably would have ripped the tendril off my face if the entity had been perhaps 10% less horrifying. Instead, I asked why I needed to be destroyed, if the trial had been conducted and ended without my knowledge. Its answer was frank and terrible: because you've been used, and we as a principle do not reissue used products. Only new vessels are provided to our clients. Upon your destruction, a new vessel will be selected to replace you, and inhabited whenever we have a client ready. I was appalled, shocked, and didn't follow up with another question. As if it had taken my silence for satisfaction, the entity retracted its tendril, and again began that spasmodic blinking, which I realized must precede the annihilating action. Though it had paralyzed me before, terror now invigorated me upon the reception of his awful knowledge, and I found myself sprinting away from the creature, circling around the grassy basin into which it had manifested. Just as I had circumnavigated the depression, the entity turned its loathsome head backwards, and the 2 eyes that rested on the forehead glared with a hateful intensity towards me. I was suddenly frozen mid-stride, incapable of even the slightest movement. Rendered immobile by that Medusian gaze, I could do nothing but watch as it moved in a way that is absolutely impossible to describe beyond the involvement of all of its parts towards me, leaving in its wake a swath of blackened grass. When it reached me, it resumed the disconcerting blinking, and I felt a tickling sensation pass along my body. Somehow, I knew, unconsciously sensed, that I was being unmade on the tiniest level, atomically undone. True annihilation. I don't know what portion of myself, what degree of substance I had lost, before I managed through sheer willpower to whisper out a final protest. Its eyes ceased to blink, and an air of annoyance arose from its abhorrent form. The tingling sensation stopped, and my mobility was abruptly relieved. What is it? I have many clients throughout this galaxy awaiting vessels, and this business must be concluded before I may meet with any of them. Despite the suspension of my movements, I still felt the effects of my earlier exertions, and breathlessly sputtered out a final plea for the sparing of my life. What if I paid you? What is this token you mentioned? The many eyes narrowed, and this time the creature merely threw out the tendril, slapping me in the forehead with it. Vessels may not lease themselves. Why not? It considered this form a moment, clearly in uncharted territory. It then continued, the token is unobtainable by your species. Only those who come from the Outre spheres may acquire them. You could not offer adequate payment. I thought for a moment, then in a moment of desperation, of hopeful ingenuity, I said, but I'm entitled to a trial, right? You needn't a valid payment method now, only if I wish to continue with the full experience. You could just annihilate me then, right? The creature then nodded, although I will spare you the ungodly details of how this was done. What is the trial period? This vessel may be utilized for the life experience trial for 20 earthen years, before payment is required to continue. I smiled, and without further questions, yanked the disgusting tendril from my forehead. The entity looked annoyed, in its monstrously ineffable way, but did not make any gestures of violence. I was going to turn away and go on home, proud that I had somehow outsmarted this eldritch being, when those two forehead-set eyes again glowed, and a crimson laser shot towards me. The beams burned through my shirt, searing my flesh as it traced lines of text down the front of my body. The twin beams stopped upon reaching my navel, then diminished, and the eyes returned to their irregular, somewhat less terrifying nature. When the immediate agony of the heated inscription ceased, I looked down and examined myself, and saw the text change as it cooled. Initially, the text had appeared to be alien runes, totally unreadable. But as the redness of my skin softened, the text, incredibly, became legible, was translated before my eyes into English. The top line, written in the largest lettering, read, "Terms and conditions." The creature gave what might have been an evilly delighted smirk, then vanished in a great shaft of fiery red light that manifested and disappeared within a few seconds. I had taken a trial subscription out on my own life, for another 2 decades. But what then? When it comes back to collect or annihilate,